This sermon is from the series Dear Church, Jesus' Letters to the Seven Churches in Revelation. It was preached at Crossway Church in Battleground, Washington. We hope you enjoy. Today we are continuing our sermon series on the seven letters to the churches in the book of Revelation. Today we find ourselves in the church of Smyrna. Now, Smyrna is an interesting word. It's one that you may be familiar with or not, but some scholars actually think that the name may actually be tied to the spice. Anyone want to guess what spice it may be? Smyrna. Myrrh. Frankincense, gold, and myrrh. You may recognize that from the Christmas story. And the reason is that it's cultivated from a spice. I guess I did put it right on the screen, so that should have given it to you. It's from a small thorn bush that's indigenous to the area. But the process, the way that they gather it, is actually quite interesting. They actually make a bunch of cuts in the bark, and this sap kind of forms, and then it hardens, and then they rip it out, and then they crushed it, is the way that they used to do it, to put it into perfumes and that. I think now they use liquid extraction or something like that. But the fact of the matter is that something beautiful, a fragrance that was used oftentimes when they, at somebody's burial, that was one of the things that was used, but it was also used for other perfumes as well, is made through such a kind of suffering. It's literally the cutting of a tree, it's the crushing. And I think that it's a great, beautiful metaphor for this church, because this was a church that was made through crushing and through suffering. If anyone knew what it was to suffer and go through persecution, it is the church of Smyrna, as you will see. As I said, persecution is probably in the process. It goes through waves, and it depends on what area it is. But throughout the Roman time, and throughout the Roman period in this time, there was all kinds of persecution that this letter was written, and it is definitely noted today. But I want you to think about that in your own life. What are those things that have felt like crushing weights? Those things that are really difficult for you to go through. No one wants to go through them, and they are absolutely painful in the midst of it. But oftentimes, God can use it to bring about something good. And I guess I would ask you this question: in the difficult things that you are going through, what kind of fragrance is coming? And my prayer and my goal, and I trust that even though it may not seem like it in the moment, that God can use it to bring about good, and that is actually the whole point of our sermon today. Maybe I've given it away already in the first 5 minutes. But today, in our sermon series, I'm going to call Beauty Under Persecution, and it is looking at Revelation 2, verses 8 through 11. And again, it is written to the church in Smyrna. This is the word of the Lord. To the church in Smyrna, to the angel of the church in Smyrna, I write. Now, again, the angel, it's unclear. It could be a messenger, so it could have been literally the pastor. It could have been an angel, an angelic being. It could have represented the church. It doesn't really matter, because it's clear at the end of this that it's meant for the church, because it says, whoever has ears, let them hear. And so even though it addresses the angel, we don't need to get into the details of what that is, rather just get into the heart of the message. To the angel of the church in Smyrna, write, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions, your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. Well, as I said, this letter is written to the church in Smyrna. Now, Ephesus was a huge and an incredible city, and Smyrna was not far off. It, too, is actually a coastal town. It is actually modern-day Izmir. These are some photos that we took in our walk there. We actually spent the night there on our transition there. The tough thing about Smyrna, actually, is it was destroyed. The ancient city was actually destroyed in a pretty big earthquake, and so there aren't that many ruins that are around because that was around 200 AD. But it was a bustling port city that was destroyed actually in 600 BC too, because they signed on with the wrong side, and the Lydians actually destroyed them. But over 300 years later, it was rebuilt by Alexander the Great. And so in the time of the writing of this letter, it was a great Greek city with all of the Greek stuff around it. And it was a pretty impressive sight. There aren't that many actual ruins because of the 200 earthquake, but you can see that there was actually this street actually that we're a photo there on my right, your left, that was covered, and in it on the sides were marketplaces that they're uncovering there in the city of Smyrna. And there it was also well known for all the different temples that they had, and it was well known for its architecture. A matter of fact, there's a couple of things to note about Smyrna, and that is Aristides. He is a Roman orator who lived in Smyrna around 117 AD to 181 AD, compared the earlier destruction and restoration of Smyrna to the phoenix that dies and returns to life. And so this was kind of a theme of the city. We are the city who's down but not defeated. We were destroyed, but we came back to life. Interesting that Jesus uses the words that he does when we see that is there. The other thing is that the wreath metaphor actually described Smyrna's impressive buildings clustered in a circular manner around Mount Pagos. Now, we're here in the old city. You can see this area that's been excavated. But on here, you'll actually see some ruins of a fortress that's up there. Our guide told us not to go up there because it was not a great part of town, and so we didn't go see those. It was also very hot, and we had gone and seen 3 other cities, so we figured that this was enough. But it's an amazing city. Again, not many of the ruins remain, not compared to Ephesus, because the sea had moved and it was not rebuilt on that area. The ruins are much greater, but it is still impressive nonetheless, and you can see some of the areas there. This city was also very loyal to Rome. They first chose Rome in the very beginning when other cities didn't. And so they were known for their loyalty. Matter of fact, there's a story when the Roman soldiers were fighting to the east of them and it was cold in the middle of winter. Literally, the citizens of Smyrna took the coats off their back and gave it to the soldiers to help them out. And this was one of the things that they were known for. Also, they had 2 temples that they're known for that just showed their devotion to Rome. The first was a temple to the goddess Roma, which is basically just to the idea of Rome. It was a later goddess that was there. And then the temple of Tiberius. If you recall, most of the Caesars viewed themselves as deity. And so if you were special, you would get a temple built to whatever emperor it is. And we'll see that Laodicea and actually others got this. But Smyrna was one of them, and they got a temple to Tiberius. And so it showed that they were devoted to Rome, which makes sense that the people who were unwilling to submit to Caesar as Lord would face persecution from this community. Because the fact of the matter is they saw them as a threat. And so they would have taken that seriously, and we will see in future things that actually there are letters from one of the local people who was in charge. Philony is the name, the younger. I guess there must have been an older one. To another emperor saying exactly that. And so it's important for us to see. Now, as we said, so that's a little bit of the backdrop of the city. And you can see actually in each of these letters that picks up different themes and different ideas that are there. That hopefully you get the idea of the thief and the idea of the wreath, not the thief, and also the idea of the phoenix and rising to new life. And so it's important for us to see that Jesus' description of himself actually picks up these themes. It's interesting, he doesn't pick up any of the actual images that we saw in that first initial passage that we looked at, like he did last time, walking amongst the lampstands, the golden lampstands. But in this one, instead, he picks up 2 different titles. He says, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life. And again, what we say in what we saw last week is each of these things is very important because it's going to communicate who Jesus is and why it's important to the church around them who is facing what they are facing. And so that first image of the first and the last is really important. There's a couple things that it highlights. We may take it for granted because it's one that we hear over and over again. But the first thing that this quote is actually from Isaiah. It's in 3 different passages. I think it's Isaiah 41, Isaiah 44, and Isaiah 48. It says, it actually validates Christ's divinity. You know, we think about Christ as divine because as Christians, that's what we've been taught. We may rattle off the Apostles' Creed, but it reminds the people of his day that Jesus is actually God, and that was the point of it. It wants them to realize that he is not just some historical figure. He is divine. He is the Godhead himself who was the creator of all the universe and sustained it all. And that's the important thing that they want to do. And we know that because in this text, Isaiah, when it's used, it's spoken about the Lord in all capital letters. It didn't cut and paste very good here when I brought it in from my Bible, but all capital letters, which means it is the name of the creator God of the universe, Yahweh. And he says, I am the Lord Almighty. I am the first and I am the last. Apart from me, there is no God. And so it highlights that very important thing about who Jesus is. This also communicates something else. It's his sovereignty over all time and history. The reference to the first and last involves a literary device called merismus. Big word, fancy word, I don't use it very often. But the fact of the matter is what it's used to describe 2 extremes that describe the whole. And so when he says, I'm the first and the last, and I am the God over all of it, what he's really trying to say is this, that I rule everything, not just the first, the last, but everything in between. And I am control over time and history, which is very important to a group of people who are suffering and going through difficult times. The other theme that he highlights, the other title that he claims, is the one who died and came back to life. That is the other title that he claims, the use that he uses to describe himself. Now, I think there's 2 things at play here. One, it picks up on this phoenix thing. You know, Smyrna was a church that prided itself in being destroyed and coming back to life. That's what its orators, its poets use to describe it. And Jesus is saying, you may think that that's a big deal, that you, the city, came back to life, and that's great. But I am the ultimate phoenix. I am the ultimate one who died and came back to life. And I think it's picking up that image, and it's written with that in mind. But even more importantly, this reminds believers who are facing persecution, who are literally dying, and we have church history records of the stuff that they suffered. I'm going to share the story of Polycarp, who was the bishop right after it, a disciple of John, which is a powerful story. It reminds those people who are suffering and are facing potential death for their faith in Christ, that death does not have victory over them because Jesus is the victor over death. He died and rose again to new life. And so it gives them hope that even though they may face death, they will have life again because of who Jesus is. And that is a powerful statement for us. Because whether we like it all or not, sin and the effects of sin have given us all a death sentence unless Christ comes before that sentence happens. And it's important for us to remember when we face death, when we see that happening in our life and it feels like it could come near, that Jesus is the one who died and came back to life again. And so we have the promise of life, as we will see in this text at the end. That's the promise that he gives us and the reminder that this church needs. These are the titles that Jesus gave himself because he wants to remind the church, this is who he is. I think it's a good reminder for us, as I said, that Jesus is sovereign over everything, that he can use everything, even difficult things for our good, and we're going to see that. But also that he is at work even when we don't see it. And to remind us that even though it may seem like this world and the effects of sin are winning, it does not win in the end, which again is the whole point of the book of Revelation. As is the manner of which each letter is written, Jesus transitions from a description of himself. Again, Jesus told John to write this letter, to accommodation of the church. And this accommodation of church of Smyrna is found in Revelation 2:9. It says, I know your affliction, your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. It's pretty easy to see here that they have endured persecution. That is right off the bat. That word affliction is kind of a crushing weight. And this is what they're going through. And as I said, church history makes it absolutely clear that that is what they've gone through. There is a historian who wrote about 100 years later that wrote all kinds of examples of what they went through. It was being fed to beasts. It was being burned at the stake. It was being beaten to a pulp. I mean, the descriptions that they use are actually pretty gory. But the most well-known one is the story of Polycarp, who was the bishop, the pastor of several house churches in the area. And he was actually a disciple of the Apostle John, who wrote this letter. And he was arrested around 115 AD during a wave of persecution against the Christians in the Roman Empire. Now, he was like 86, I think 83 or 86, I forget. I have the quote later. I'll read it in a little bit. But at some point, he knew that the persecution was coming. He actually got a vision from the Lord in a time of prayer that he was going to have to endure this trial. And so the people tried to get him out of the city to avoid it. And so he hid. And actually one of his own family members sold him out. A young man was literally beaten to a pulp and finally gave it up after being persecuted. And the people went and got him. And this man greeted them. He was hiding up in an upper level, and rather than trying to run away, he just said, I'm going to greet my people who are coming after me. And those soldiers were so shocked at this man's demeanor and his kindness to them. He offered them a meal. Can you believe that? These guys are going to take him away, and he knows he's going to be persecuted, and he offered them a meal, and he asked them, can I just pray for an hour before you take me in? And they did so. This man was eventually burned at the stake. That's why the flames are around him. And I'm going to share some of the quotes because I think they're better in the area where it talks about how they stood up like they did. But this is just one example of what the church of Smyrna went through. And this is why the church commended them. Again, what you need to realize is the particular vibe of the city is we are pro-Rome and we are going to do everything we can to preserve their power and their might. And the Christians were an assault to that because the Christians refused to say Caesar is Lord. Earlier in Roman history, they didn't have to do that, but as the Romans, Caesars kind of got more arrogant and thought that they were more godlike, one of the things that you needed to do as a Roman citizen or as a member of the Roman territory was to declare that Caesar was Lord and pinch some incense towards them in some areas. And the Christians refused because they only had one Lord. And so the Smyrna officials saw them as an assault. They called them atheists because they refused to declare Caesar as Lord. And so they attacked them and persecuted them. And Jesus says, I know that you are being afflicted and you are going through suffering. Now, it wasn't just the martyrdom that some of them went through. It seems that all of them faced it at some point. It says that you're poor. Now, we're not sure why they're poor. I mean, the reality is the majority of the church came through the lower class, although there was also wealthy people as well. That was the cool thing about the church back then. The person who was your master, you could be their slave, but in the church, you were equals. But this is the only church that was noted for economic suffering. And so it seems that the culture of that city was one where they could take advantage of the Christians. That was the culture. They were kind of the guys that everything was going after. And so oftentimes, Hebrews 10 actually says that people were plundered. They came into their home and just stole their stuff because they were the outcasts and blamed for everything. almost like the Jews in the in-between time as they're moving towards the concentration camps in World War II, where people would just steal their stuff or bash their stores. It could be, too, that because they refused to bow to a deity, that they were not allowed certain jobs. There was trade unions. And one of the things that you usually had to do is to profess your faith in the deity of that union, or they just didn't like them, and so they probably had that. We don't know what caused the poverty, but the fact of the matter is that they faced it. And it wasn't just like, hey, we're low income. It seems to me that they faced extreme poverty, or else he wouldn't have known it. Now, Jesus says, but you're rich. Maybe not on earth, but again, he's highlighting what the reward that they have in heaven. The crown is what we'll hear about in a little bit. But he acknowledges that their faith in Christ has consequences on their or their material wealth. And he acknowledges that. The other thing that he acknowledges is that the Jews brought accusations against them. The Jews were in this particular spot where they had some freedoms that other people didn't. Other religions didn't. However, they had to pay for it. And it was kind of precarious after they led a revolt where the temple was completely destroyed in 70 AD. And so they were really kind of on edge. The other thing that you need to realize is that the Romans really viewed the Christians as Jews. Many of them came from Jewish faith, and obviously Jesus is the fulfillment of the Jewish faith. And so the Christians could kind of go under the radar and do what they wanted to do because the Romans just thought that they were a Jewish sect because they came out of Jerusalem and just followed Jesus, a Jew. And the Jews were angry about this. And so what they would do is that they would actually bring accusations against them and claim that they weren't really Jews, that they were Christians instead, which is true. They were. They didn't follow the Judaism of the day because they believed that Jesus Christ was the fulfillment of it. And so they would go and bring all kinds of accusations against the Christians so that they could have their freedoms, the Jews could have their freedoms, and distinguish themselves from the Christians because they were threatened by them. They didn't like the fact that they refused to call Caesar Lord, and they see where things were headed, and they didn't want that to come after the Jewish people as well. And so they would literally bring accusations against the Christians. And again, as I said earlier, there's letters between a local leader, whose name is Philony the Younger, and Emperor Trajan that speak of a list of names that people gave them of Christians who refused to follow Caesar as Lord. And he interrogated them. And he talks all about how he interrogated them. And some claim not to be Christians, others did. And those that did, who refused to say that Caesar was Lord, he lists all the different things that he did. And Trajan said, good job. This is what I need you to do. Seek these people out. And so we know that there's extra biblical data that supports what this letter says. Now, it's interesting to me that John actually says that these Jews are not true Jews, but they're the synagogue of Satan. Now, that's pretty powerful. But I think what he's saying is that all of Judaism pointed to Christ. That's the whole point of the Old Testament. Everything points to Jesus. That's why every time we preach a sermon here at Crossway, in the Old Testament, we try and make that connection to Jesus. And so when the Jews didn't follow the Messiah that had been promised them, the ones that they were longing for, they were no longer part of the people of God. The people of God is all centered around who Jesus is. The Old Testament pointed, and even all the sacrifices, pointed to the grace that was given to them. And so it's interesting that John makes this distinction, that Christianity is the true fulfillment of Judaism. And so if they weren't following that anymore, they weren't of God. They were actually of Satan. And it's an important distinction to see here, even for us today, that ultimately the Jews need to put their hope and trust in Jesus to be saved and to be part of God's family. But these were the accusations. They were in a time period, the Christians were, where they didn't know who was going to rat them out. I mean, if you've ever lived in the communist era, you know that that's true too. We were in the Communist Museum this summer, and it's like everybody was afraid because everybody was listening, and they had every kind of informant that was ratting people out. And people were literally afraid to say anything. This is what the Jews, the Christians in Smyrna went through. They had people who were out to get them, informing against them. They faced poverty. People were going after them. and they face persecution. And Jesus says, I know what you're going through. And I want to commend you as a church that you're willing to do all that. It's a powerful thing if you really think about what they went through. Now, normally in the spot, what we would see is that there was a rebuke or a warning. But this is one of the two letters that's not the case, in case it moves just to Jesus' encouragement. Unlike other churches, Smyrna received no rebuke or warning. Jesus says, I see what you're going through, and I see how you are standing up. I see what you're enduring. And so he doesn't rebuke them at all. Rather, he gives them an encouragement. And there's two things that he encourages them to do. The first one is he says, never be afraid. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't ever have fear come after us, but he says, never let that fear win. And the language that he says is, it's like an ongoing, ever-present thing. That's why I phrase it the way I did. It's just not, do not be afraid. It's like, don't ever be, just realize that the sovereign God of the universe is in control and he is at work. And that's what he says. So he encourages them to never be afraid. Now, that means that they probably were afraid, and that's the challenge, is to say, try not to let that fear take over you. And he gives them two reasons, or different reasons on why that they don't have to be afraid. The first one is he says that the devil is going to come after you. He already said that the Jews are acting on Satan's behalf. They're the synagogue of Satan, and they are coming after you and bringing those accusations. Now, some of our things that happen to us are the results of our own sin. That's just the reality of it. But sometimes Satan is at work and we don't even understand it. And sometimes we don't ever know what the reason is. But sin and Satan are always, the effects of sin and Satan are always at work in our lives. And what he says here is, I tell you that the devil will put some of you in prison to test you. Now, what we need to realize is the devil wants to put us in these difficult situations to break us. That's his goal, to separate us from God. He literally is going to be labeled as the accusers of the brothers later on. And the whole goal is to try and get them to doubt God's love for them and to give up their faith. And what Jesus hints at in this letter is that that's what the devil wants to do to the people in Smyrna and to the people of our day as well. But he says that God will only allow it to test you. That's the language that he uses. Now, I know the way that the English translation is that it's not quite as clear, but that's the point that the text is trying to get across. That yes, this thing may seem where it's going to break us, but again, there's this assurance that God can use it and that God can be at work in it, even when we don't feel it. And so even though it feels like this difficult thing and overwhelming thing and this thing that's going to break us, that ultimately, if God is at work in our life, it will just be a test. Now, it doesn't mean it's going to be an easy test. It doesn't mean it's going to be this thing that we enjoy and that we don't go through all kinds of difficult situations that will break us, that will break our spirit. And we will have to go through all kinds of different challenges. But there's a difference between going through challenges that push us to our limits and having a God who is there. That's why Paul says that your grace is sufficient. Your power is made perfect in my weakness. And that's what John is trying to remind. Jesus is trying to remind the church in the middle of this text. It's that God will be with you in your weakness. And even though it feels overwhelming, his power will be sufficient for you. And even though it may seem greater than what it is a test. And that is the point that he's trying to make. Now, I told you about Polycarp. I mean, Polycarp, you just go read the martyrdom of Polycarp. It is a powerful story. As I said, he literally was caught in that room, and the guy gave him food and gave them something to drink. And the people were literally amazed because they'd come in with all their cop gear ready to get this young man, and they got this old 86-year-old guy. And they're like, why are we treating him this way? Somebody who we come after and are ready to kill and persecute, and he treats us with grace and compassion. Well, when they brought him before the Roman proconsul, the guy saw his age too, and he went through these repeated steps. He says, if you don't do anything, I'm going to feed you to the animals. So he says, just please bow to Caesar as Lord. And Polycarp says this, 86 years have I served him, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? And then he says, okay, fine. If that doesn't scare you, I'm gonna threaten you with flames. And this is the line that he says. You threaten me with the fire which burns for an hour and then is extinguished. But you know nothing of the fire of the coming judgment and eternal punishment reserved for the ungodly. I didn't put the line here because it was there, but he says, why are you waiting? This is a man who knows that Jesus will give him the strength that he needs, and he can speak with that kind of boldness. This is a man who views the ultimate giving of his life in a horrendous death as a test, because he knows that Jesus is the first and the last, the one who was dead and came to life. And he is that even in his death, it will bring him to eternal life. This is a man who was given God's strength in the midst of adversity, if I have ever seen it. And the promise that Jesus gave them in this text came to fruition. Now, I pray that you and I never have to endure that. But the fact of the matter is that you and I make small decisions all the time about how we will live our lives. And if we truly want to follow Christ, it means that we will have to give up sacrifices. There are things that we will have to give up. There are attitudes and actions that we will have to let go. There are actually, we will face many persecutions sometimes and slander for different things. But we need to trust that God can use it ultimately for good, and he will give us the strength that we need to get through each of those challenges. The third thing that he highlights here is that their suffering will be brief. He says that some of you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Now, 10 days symbolizes two things. Again, we need to remember we're apocalyptic, which means symbols and numbers and all those things have meanings. I don't take it that they only suffered persecution for 10 days, but rather it's just what he's trying to say is that it is going to be for a limited amount of time. My thought here is that God is trying to give them a little bit of a bigger perspective. And he says, I know that it's going to feel like this is a big deal, and it is a big deal. I don't want to minimize that, but there will be an end to it. There will be a relief to it. And so that is one thing that I think it communicates. 10 days communicates a limited time. But even more importantly, 10 days for people who know their Bible and the believers of that day would have rang a bell. It would have been one of those things like 10 days, that seems important. And throughout the book of Revelation, we've seen where he picks up these images from the book of Daniel. And this is one of those times when he does. It's actually, I think, recalls how God worked in Daniel 1, where they faced the same thing. And this time, Daniel and his companions were brought to the thing of Nebuchadnezzar, and they were wanting to be given royal food. Now, they knew what had happened to. Most of it had probably been sacrificed to idols already, and they were stuck in the spot. Later, people were literally having to bow down to an image, and they had a choice of what to do. And so this 10 days would have reminded them about how God worked in all of this. In Daniel 1:8, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief officer for permission to not defile himself this way. And it goes on in 14 that says he allowed him to do it for a test for 10 days. Now, it turns out that Daniel and his friends who didn't eat all this food were better health than the people who did, and so they actually went in that direction. But again, the point here is that the 10 days would have referred to people who had gone through this situation where they had a decision to be loyal to God or to be loyal to the empire of their day. And when they were faithful to God, God worked, and God worked in all of that. And so even in that phrase, 10 days, that's what they're communicating. that God is at work and God will be faithful to you. And so it's an encouragement that they can be faithful and true to God in that time as well. The second thing that the encouragement that John gives is that to be faithful until death. It says, be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you your life as a victor's crown. This is one of those encouragements where you're like, thanks, but no thanks. I mean, he basically said that some of you are going to die. I don't personally wouldn't like to hear that. I would rather just hear the encouragement to be faithful. But Jesus wanted to be honest with them, that this is what some of the people were going to have to endure. And so he encourages them to be faithful, to stay true. Now again, in all of this, I want you to see there's a command to be faithful, and then it's a recognition of all of this as a gift. It's a gift from God. It means that God is the one who's at work. He's always at work, even when we don't feel it. And so the weight of all this faithfulness, the weight of all this lack of fear is not just on ourselves, but we need to trust that the Spirit of God is at work behind the scenes, guiding and directing us, shaping and molding us, and giving us the strength that we may not even see in ourselves. And he's the one who can empower us to be faithful. His Spirit can. But he gives them two things that their faithfulness, that God's giving them, and working in all of this will provide them. The first is that they would receive the victor's crown of life, which is a symbol of eternal reward. Now, I already told you that the city of Smyrna was known for its crown. The buildings formed a crown around that hill, and it was a beautiful thing. There's poetry that describes that as their head, and that the Smyrna was adorned with this crown of beauty. Also, what you may not realize is that Smyrna was also had a huge gymnasium and had their set of games. And the athletes, the win that they got, the victor got a crown made out of leaves. You can see a statue there that shows it. But I think that Jesus is saying that the ultimate, you guys are obsessed with all these crowns, the crown of the victory in athletics, the crown of being the most beautiful city of your area. But the crown that you ultimately need to search after, the one that's most important, is the crown of eternal life. Be faithful, don't fear, and know that I'm at work, and I am the one that will give that to you, is the word that he gives them. He says, let those fading crowns remind you of the lasting crown of life that you need to go after, and continue to focus on your hope and trust that's in my death and resurrection. That is what will get you through. The other thing that he gives them is that they would not be harmed by the second death or eternal judgment. Now, this is the first time in Revelation that this comes up. It'll come in later. But really what he's talking about here is that what happens when we die and when Christ comes again, there's a final judgment that's described in Revelation 20. And it says, blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years. We're not going to go into that, don't worry. But then he says, the death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire, and the lake of fire is the second death, and that's eternal judgment and separation from God. And what he says that is faithful Christians who are faithful because of the power of God in their lives will not only be given eternal life, but that eternal life means that they will avoid this eternal punishment. That is something that they get. That is something that is powerful. And that's something that gives them hope. They don't have to fear death because they know that they will spend eternity with God. And that all the effects of sin, all the effects of it, the pain, the sorrow, the suffering, all of that will be removed. That gives them hope to a people who are going through difficult times. When we went to Turkey, one of the things that they did is they took us to a rug factory. Turkey used to actually be known for making rugs by hand. They were known as that. The girls and I had a lot of fun actually in Istanbul because they would we were in a marketplace and all the rug dealers are trying to sell me stuff, One of them, we were just going to go buy water. He said he'd give me free water for a rug. And I said, that's a pretty expensive thing of water. And so we had a good banter. But they took us to this place where they were actually teaching women and men in rural villages to make handmade rugs again. And they were selling them. A rug from the front looks really beautiful. This is an image of a crown. A rug on the back doesn't look so beautiful because it's a matter of knots and twists and things and tied. I think what Jesus is trying to do here is to tell the people of Smyrna, right now your life feels like the backside of that rug. You may not understand what God's plan for you is right now because you're facing persecution and suffering, poverty, accusations, and it's difficult. But he reminds them that he is the first and the last. He is the one who died and rose again. And so the difficult things of our life do not determine our life story. Rather, it is what the other side is. And so it may feel like in the midst of our suffering that our life is in a bunch of knots and it's painful, and it is painful. I do not want to minimize that. But the letter to Smyrna reminds us that the God of the universe, the one who's from the verse and the end and the last, the very beginning, who rules over all of it, has a plan for our life too. And what he's trying to do is to say that when we flip over the tapestry of our lives in that final moment, we will see that none of this was purposeless. That God used all of it, including the most difficult things, to bring about some good. And that's what he wants to remind the church of Smyrna. That even though it feels like the picture of the threads, God is at work and he has a plan. And his plan is bringing about our redemption, but also good out of it. And so we don't have to fear pain and suffering. We can be faithful because we know that God is at work and he will always be at work. Let's pray.
You have just watched a sermon from Crossway Church in Battleground, Washington. We hope that you enjoyed it, and we'd love to have you come join us for a worship service on Sunday at 10 a.m. at 311 North Parkway Avenue in Battleground, Washington. If you'd like to find more information about us online, you can find it at crosswaychurchwa.com.